Joseph James D'Angelo, also known as the Golden State Killer, committed murders, burglary, and rape in California throughout the 1970s and 1980s, and he was only caught in 2018. It was thought that his reign of terror would have become a cold case. Surprisingly enough, he was caught nearly 4 decades later through the smallest amount of DNA put into a DNA testing system. His DNA was retrieved through tissues off his property. And through these tests, investigators connected his DNA samples back to his relatives through the DNA database of an ancestry testing program. This led to the prosecution for multiple cold cases that occurred over 4 decades prior. Something as overlooked as DNA tests can connect itself to something much larger. Think about your DNA. Who are you related to? Where is your family from? What stories and implications are held in your DNA?
DNA testing is a DNA-based test that analyzes a person's genome and verifies ancestral relationships, indications of genetic conditions, and cross-examines genes. The testing process is done through buccal scraps and blood tests. DNA is submitted through swabs, scrapping, and collected bodily fluids at testing centers, which is then analyzed through restrictive fragment length polymorphism and gene sequencing. DNA testing allows for ancestry tests to be done. Ancestry tests are done through submitting genetic samples to companies. Some of these companies include 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, MyHeritage, and Family Tree DNA. Each of these companies provide different services, such as information regarding telomeres, predisposition to medical conditions, and specific genetic traits like earwax types. Trace genome markers and correlations to ancestral genealogical informations are utilized to analyze genetic information. After the DNA is sequenced, it is compared to the DNA of others in a large database. Similarities are used to generate an ethnic group estimate. After getting the ancestral genetic information, the information can be used to track ancestral movements and find ethnic and geographic origins. Additionally, potential diseases, mutations, and recessive traits associated with certain ethnic groups can be accessed. Predictions for genetically predisposed diseases include cancer, diabetes, and even some mental illnesses.
Here's a quick tutorial and background video from Ancestry.com describing how to take a genetic test and what it entails.
When you get your kit in the mail, it comes in a box. The first thing you have to do is you have to go online and activate your kit. You put in your secret number, and that gets activated. The second thing you do is you spit into a little tube, and then you put it in a box and you mail it back to us. And the laboratory takes this little DNA solution, takes a little bit of it out, isolates your DNA out of it, and it subjects your DNA to a pretty complicated and really snazzy test to measure it at 700,000 regions all throughout your genome.
Those 700,000 regions, known in the science community as single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs for short, are tiny mutations in our DNA that make us all unique. Ancestry DNA scientists then go in and compare your SNPs to SNPs from people all over the world.
We use a big collection of samples that have been collected from around the world, from Mongolia to lots of different populations in Africa, all over Europe, Mexico, South America. We've got samples from all over the world.
Ancestry DNA is connecting people like never before.
Aside from tracing ancestral origins, DNA testing can be used to track down perpetrators and evidence in crime. Crime scenes and forensic work cross-examine and test for DNA matches at crime scenes. DNA can be used to identify victims or criminals. As previously mentioned, it can even find relatives of the person of interest. Paternity and maternity tests are enough examples of DNA tests used in the court of law.
How can we protect the information of DNA testing companies mentioned earlier in terms of privacy? On top of law enforcement gaining access to this data, private companies will often use the information they gain from DNA tests and sell that data to insurance companies or other third parties. This is because there is not much protection over DNA testing that is done outside of a healthcare setting or done by a doctor, because there is no law for it. While there is federal law, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, that protects people from genetic discrimination from health insurance companies, it does not protect them from other forms of insurance companies, such as life, disability, or long-term care insurance. Not only are third parties getting unnecessary information, but there's been a lot of controversy around whether or not certain information that can change the scope of someone's life over potential conditions they may be predisposed to that they were not aware of should be shared. Or even discussing a more personal way of giving information like that to them. Just because we can know, should we know? Is it always worth the stress? Sometimes ignorance is bliss, but then again, knowledge is power. An example of commonly used DNA testing in a court are paternity tests in a custody case of minor or child support. Despite being court mandated, the law cannot enforce a paternity test, meaning it cannot be refused. But not refused without that party facing a penalty in the form of a fine or mutually agreed terms. As previously mentioned, DNA testing has the capabilities of indicating disease and predispositions. Companies such as 23andMe offer services that can detect genes that indicate risk to potential diseases, such as the BRCA gene, which increases risk of both breast and ovarian cancer. The test is also considered other potential hereditary diseases, such as Alzheimer's and celiac disease. Although it may seem beneficial to have knowledge of risks and have increased awareness, many recipients of results have reported feeling unnecessary stress and anxiety, especially over potential conditions not guaranteed and diagnosed conditions. In 2013, the FBI even wrote letters concerning the interpretations and potential inaccuracies of health and genetic information. There is a fear that individuals will make harmful choices due to misleading information from tests. A class action lawsuit has also been filed against the company for misrepresentations of their genetic tests. Presently, 23andMe does not offer tests about health risks, but rather tests for carrier status of certain genes, such as cystic fibrosis and sickle cell. Wellness reports are also done on traits with less serious connotations, such as alcohol or lactose intolerance. DNA testing has its limitation. DNA can only be compared with already existing sequences within databases. If there are sequences that are unavailable or lack many matches, comparisons can be very difficult. This problem occurs when there is limitation in variation of genetic information. Ancestral DNA testing has its very problem. Often, companies will lack genetic information on non-American or Western European ancestry. There is a limited amount of information due to lack of testing and research on outside groups. This is a predominant problem between ethnic and geographical groups. There tends to be an underrepresentation of groups from Africa, South America, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Causes have been attributions of Eurocentric ideology, wealth differences by region, and systematic racism. Additionally, classifications of race can be misleading and inaccurate. Phenotypic traits do not always directly correlate with race, and genetic information can give limited answers.
All right, now that we've discussed some of the ethical implications that DNA testing can bring about, as well as the process about which DNA testing undergoes, here are some ethical dilemmas or situations to consider regarding DNA testing to check for your understanding. So use what you have learned from this lesson to answer and reflect about what you would do if you were placed in the following kind of situation. We will pause for a few seconds to allow you to think, but we will conclude with a real-life situation similar to each example to show how things actually played out. For the first dilemma, a terrible crime has been committed. There is a suspect, but there is not enough evidence to bring them in for a DNA test. However, a sample of DNA has been received. Would it be unethical to run a DNA test without the consent of this person, even though you could potentially stop future crime? Take a second to gather your thoughts and post them on the Padlet board. Situation number 2. Someone submits their DNA for genetic testing for an ancestry test in order to learn more about their ancestors, but not for a health screening. As an analyst who works at the company, you have found that they have a high chance of developing cancer. Do you tell them personally, if at all? If you do, you may face legal repercussions, and it is against your work policy to do it. But if you don't, they will receive it in the mail, or they may never know. So what do you do? Again, take a moment to think and post your thoughts on the Padlet. Now that you've taken the time to think about how you would react in that situation yourself, I'm going to relay some real-life examples that are very close to the situations we asked you to think about earlier. For the first example, here's an article that shows a situation where a judge allowed for searching of DNA of millions of Americans tested without their consent in order to find a terrible criminal. In this situation, the judge felt as though the threat of the crime outweighed any injustice done to these Americans and their DNA. Is that what you would have done? For the second example, this article shows how this situation played out from the perspective of someone who took the test and found out that they had a high risk of cancer. The woman in this situation relayed how devastated she was upon opening those results from the online portal. She was then told by some people that sometimes these tests are wrong, that there's only a 99% chance correctness. So with that hope, she went in to see her doctor, who unfortunately ended up confirming that the test was true and accurate. She explained, however, that the result coming from a doctor and counselor was much more comforting than seeing it online, because she was not allowed to process the information the same way. The comfort that another human can provide in that situation, she says, was very much needed for that type of news. Hopefully that provides some insight about how these situations can play out in the real world and whether they're similar to how you would have reacted. In this lesson, we have addressed the background and uses of genetic testing, particularly with private companies. The legal, ethical, and social dilemmas of genetic testings have also been reviewed. There can exist conflicts from accuracy of information to the justification of actions from private companies. As current students, it is important to recognize that many opportunities and issues can arise from our prospective fields. Particularly in STEM and biological fields, there exists many ethical issues with approaches from multiple perspectives. As members of society, we should work to consider and fix any ethical dilemma we come across, as well as reevaluating our own choices and actions. We should recognize variety of opportunities we have in genetics and ethics, such as research or studying of legal cases surrounding bioethical issues. In the future, there may be more cases similar to the Golden State Killer case that can be solved via DNA testing, so these ethical concerns will continue to arise and make us all question what types of biological data deserve to be private as opposed to being available to government officials. In addition, as science and technology advance, so will ethical concerns. So getting a good understanding of these types of situations now is much better before things start to get more out of hand. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something new today.